From the Albuquerque Journal, this is the leading news. I'm Gino Gutierrez. It's Tuesday, July 14th. Here's what we're covering on today's episode. More than a year after New Mexico lawmakers voted to overhaul the state's behavioral health system, implementation of a new region-based approach is still a work in progress. With more on this, I'm now joined by the Journal's Capitol Bureau Chief, Dan Boyd. Dan, thank you so much for joining me.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
So Dan, behavioral health was a really big issue that took place during the last 60-day legislative session, which was in 2025, and lawmakers were really trying to figure out how to address this issue and how best to put forth the state's resources, and they passed a suite of laws to address that. Your most recent story is looking at this new region-based behavioral health solution. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so given the background, mental health and substance abuse issues have been reported on a lot in New Mexico in recent years, especially recently, talking about fentanyl issues. The homeless issues is all kind of tied up in mental health as well to a large degree. And, kind of given this background, legislators in the 2025 session really kind of came to an agreement, said, we're spending all this money. It doesn't seem to be making a big impact. We're going to change the way things are done. And they came up with this approach that's much more regional based, that each 13 regions in the state, and each of these regions are kind of tasked with coming up with a plan, identifying local priorities, kind of with the idea that local officials, county, tribal, kind of know their regions best and know what they need and what gaps they have as far as providing these types of services. So, we wrote a lot about when this bill was being passed last year, when it was signed into law by the governor, but now we're kind of starting to see it being implemented. And so the story I've been working on for, the last few days, really kind of how that process is going and some of kind of the growing pains and some of the challenges with implementation of this new system.
And Dan, as you mentioned in your reporting, each of these regions having to develop their own plan, but something that caught my eye was the fact that only 2 plans have been approved so far. Several more could be approved in the coming months, but do we know exactly why there's been a delay in these plans being approved? Is it lead times on development, or what exactly is it?
Yeah, I think some of it is just kind of getting up to speed with who's going to be kind of involved with drafting these regional plans. There's something called mapping, this process of kind of what are our current resources, what's it look like for somebody, an individual maybe with mental health issues who into contact with the judicial system, or kind of the different steps along the way. So I think it's taking time for everyone to be speaking the same language, so to speak. Now kind of finally moving forward, and like you said, 2 plans have been adopted, expecting, multiple more plans to be scrutinized over the next month or so. But that said, there are still some questions about, how state funds are distributed to these regions to implement their plans, kind of the role of tribal governments in that process, and kind of, a few advocates I talked to really saying, is there enough kind of central kind of state oversight of this whole process and making sure that these different regional plans kind of complement each other?
So, Dan, one of these regional plans that you mentioned in your story was a recently approved one in northern New Mexico that has some priorities such as detox facilities, on-demand transportation, and workforce development. But one interesting part of it was the potential use of traditional Native American healing practices. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I'm talking to a few of the senators and the architects of this initial plan, kind of, they say really the idea is these regional plans will be a way to identify priorities and maybe try some new things and see if they work, a little bit kind of trial and error. But if they do work and they show some real promise and some data that they're actually effective, treating addiction, substance abuse, mental health, that maybe these are things the state could then pursue and put more money toward and maybe even eventually qualify for Medicaid. So yeah, somebody had mentioned to me the idea of one of the tribes, and I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but using some kind of traditional Native techniques to treat addiction. And, it sounds like there could be some promise there. We'll see. Obviously, there's going to have to be some data kind of backing these up. But I do think at this part of the process, it's a little bit trial and error, and it'll be interesting to see kind of what ends up being successful and showing some promise and what maybe doesn't, and I think these plans will be adjusted then going forward. But it's a big new step for the state who before had really done everything kind of from a centralized basis, and now really letting different parts of the state take the lead on identifying these priorities.
And Dan, the interesting part about all of these new programs that are being approved is that it comes at a time where in the recent years, the state has not been a slouch when it's come to spending on behavioral health. Over $843 million to be exact is what you report in your story over the past 6 years, but only 76% of that funding has been spent, and a recent audit found that some children's behavioral health funds were even misused. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think that kind of contributed to the frustration I mentioned, legislators feeling like they've put a lot of money toward these programs and they haven't really moved the needle. Some of the money, as you mentioned, hasn't been spent. This audit showed that maybe CYFD had misspent some money or not spent it exactly what it was intended for. And I think, I'd be remiss not to say a lot of this, concern even goes back to during the administration of former Governor Susana Martinez, who, as was widely documented, kind of froze the behavioral health system, kind of alleging fraud and overbilling, and that really led to a kind of a overhaul of the system, having to bring in new providers. But I think a bipartisan sense, that since that time about 10 years ago, that just the current system wasn't working, that had never really been fixed since then, and at least this approach was a new way of doing things, and I think obviously the jury's still out on whether it's going to be effective or not.
And as the rollout continues on this plan, Dan, one of the more interesting parts of your story that you point out is that state and local officials are still continuing to debate how the money will be distributed to the regions, and critics are also warning that the lack of clear state guidelines, tribal coordination, and oversight could also hinder the success of this system as well.
And I think we see that a lot when, we cover here at the Roundhouse how, new laws being passed, but in implementation, there are questions that come up about that maybe weren't covered in when the law was first addressed or first crafted. And, one thing I heard a lot at a meeting last week is whether state funding whether these local governments should be reimbursed for these regional plans, whether the money should flow to them right away, even though their plans might not be adopted yet. And so, kind of things like that, I think where the devil really is in the details. That's an analogy we hear a lot, but I think there's some truth to that. So I think it's important to kind of follow up and kind of cast a spotlight on these implementation, even though it can be a little bumpy, a little messy at times. But, seeing if kind of the promise of what was touted at the time of the bill being passed actually matches the eventual reality of it. And another piece of this on the funding front, too, is legislators did create a new trust fund for behavioral health programs, and money's already starting to flow into that fund. So ideally, there will be money down the road for these programs. But I think right now the challenge is just getting them stood up and getting these regional plans in place.
And Dan, last question before I let you go. We've touched on multiple times during this conversation about how the state is really in need of these behavioral health services. And you mentioned in your story some statistics that really shed a lot of light on how big of an issue this really is. The state is continuing to face some of the nation's worst behavioral health outcomes, including one of the highest suicide rates, widespread anxiety and depression, and a 22.7% increase in drug overdose deaths last year. And that comes even as overdose deaths nationally declined. So really these services coming at a time where the state is in really dire need of them.
Yeah, some pretty stark challenges, and I think it's one issue that really puts the juxtaposition facing the state that we are flush with money right now, especially from the oil industry, but we still have these really deeply rooted issues that we've seen. Just throwing more money at them doesn't necessarily solve them, and it's going to. I think we've seen that with education as well, but certainly with behavioral health. That unless we can find a way to better administer these funds and really better implement them and come up with a more effective system, I don't think we can expect to see these trends change overnight.
So the rollout of these new behavioral health systems continuing to roll out across New Mexico as each of these regions continue to finalize their plans and lawmakers debate how they will spend the money. And Dan, I'm sure we'll be keeping tabs on it as the rollout continues.
Definitely. Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. And I think it's an issue we're going to try to keep focused on and keep reporting on, coming months, coming years, and I'm sure for a long time to come.
The owners of the former Lindy's Diner have filed a lawsuit against the city of Albuquerque, claiming officials unnecessarily demolished the historic 120-year-old Bliss building and denied them due process. The suit alleges the city rushed the demolition after part of the building collapsed in April, gave the owners conflicting deadlines, and ignored state and city procedures for condemning a building. Attorney Michael Cadigan argues the structure could have been stabilized and eventually restored, and claimed the city's own actions worsened the damage by using heavy equipment that caused an additional collapse. The lawsuit also challenges a city lien placed on the property to recover demolition costs and accused officials of violating New Mexico's Inspection of Public Records Act by withholding requested documents. The city disputes those claims, saying the building posed an immediate threat to public safety and that the owners failed to follow through on plans to demolish it themselves. Officials say they acted only after giving the owners time to address the dangerous structure. The lawsuit also names State Farm, alleging the insurer improperly denied claims after covering the building for years. No court date has been set, and the case is expected to determine whether the city acted lawfully in ordering the demolition of one of downtown Albuquerque's historic landmarks. The future of one of New Mexico's most historic newspapers is uncertain. Citing financial challenges, the Roswell Daily Record announced on Monday that it is ceasing operations after more than a century in business. In a now-deleted statement, the paper said it is liquidating assets to cover outstanding debts while actively seeking a buyer or another solution to keep the paper operating under new ownership. The Daily Record has struggled with declining revenue for years, reducing its print schedule in 2024, moving its printing operations to Santa Fe in 2025, and recently switching from carrier delivery to direct mail in an effort to cut costs. Founded in 1891, the newspaper is best known for its iconic July 8, 1947 front page, declaring that the Roswell Army Airfield had captured a, quote, flying saucer, a headline that helped cement Roswell's place in UFO history. If the closure becomes permanent, the Roswell Daily Record will become the second New Mexico newspaper to shut this year, following the Gallup Independent, which published its final edition in January. And the Albuquerque Hispano Chamber of Commerce has named Roberta Ritchie as its next president and CEO, succeeding longtime leader Ernie Tabaka, who is retiring after nearly 10 years at the helm. Ritchie, who has served as the Chamber's chief experience officer for the past 4 years, was selected following a national search. A South Valley native, she previously held leadership roles at the University of New Mexico, Central New Mexico Community College, and the National Hispanic Cultural Center before joining the Chamber. As president and CEO, Ritchie will oversee efforts to support entrepreneurs and small businesses, advocate for pro-business policies, strengthen public and private partnerships, and expand international trade opportunities established under Tabaka's leadership. Ritchie says she's taking over at a challenging time for New Mexico businesses, pointing to inflation, staffing shortages, and limited resources that have forced some longtime local businesses to close. She says her priority will be helping businesses adapt and grow while continuing the Chamber's mission of strengthening Albuquerque's Hispanic and small business communities. Ritchie will officially begin her new role next week. The Leading News is powered by the journalism of the Albuquerque Journal. If you enjoy hearing all of the stories we share with you here daily, please consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Journal by utilizing the discount code in our show notes. Every subscription helps support local journalism and allows us to provide you with the news that matters to you. Now taking a look at Albuquerque's weather forecast, there is a 20% chance of showers and thunderstorms after 12 p.m., sunny with a high near 94. As for this evening, you can expect a 20% chance of showers and thunderstorms before 9 p.m., partly cloudy with a low around 67. To keep up with all the latest news from the Albuquerque Journal, you can visit our website at abqjournal.com. That's the Leading News. I'm Gino Gutierrez. We'll be back tomorrow.